Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm just going to be talking about the books that I read this week. And it's a week where there was quite a lot of travelling for me. So I went to go and visit a friend for her wedding. And so I was in the lovely place of Northern Ireland for the week. And actually, sort of partly intentionally, partly unintentionally, my reading sort of took on a bit of an Irish sort of lilt, or not even lilt, kind of sort of set of references, I guess, for that time. So let's kind of get stuck into the books that I read. First up, one of the books that I intentionally read knowing that I was going to be going to Northern Ireland, and that is Patrick Radden Keefe's Say Nothing. And I really loved his another book of his, Empire of Pain, which is all about the Sackler dynasty. And this book is very different. It talks all about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, but it has that same sort of investigative journalism that I think makes Empire of Pain so effective. This kind of combination of really kind of nailing down the details about some of the key aspects of it all, but also really telling personal stories throughout the whole book as well. So I found this book really quite profound and really quite affecting. It's a really deep dive into some big parts of Northern Ireland and the Troubles and various other parts of history. And it's unflinching. It talks a lot about, for example, the various sort of hunger strikes that people endured at the time, the various ways that people failed either side, the way that the politicians were both positive and very negative forces in many parts of the history. It's a really complicated history, and I'm no expert still after having read it, and that's not a thing on the book. It's a huge issue and a really complicated one at that. But I think this book does a really good job of introducing you to it, not necessarily from a complete beginner's perspective, although I think it actually is quite good at guiding you through from that side. But I think it kind of also doesn't play with kid gloves, right? It's a book that goes all in and decides to give you everything. It's a brutal and difficult read, but very, very important, I think. Next up, I read a couple of new releases. So I read Mrs. S by Kay Patrick. And Kay Patrick was named as one of the young writers to sort of look out for by Granta magazine. And they do this sort of best young novelists list every 10 years or so. And Mrs. S is this really interesting book. It kind of, on the surface, seems like it's just going to be a story about basically like an all-girls school, a boarding school. And it seems at first like it has all the sort of traditional tropes of those sorts of boarding school mysteries or kind of tales like that. But actually, I think this book does some really interesting, rich things to play around with it. At the heart of it, we've got our main character who is sort of full of desire for the wife of the headmaster of the school, and that obviously feels laden with sort of difficulty. It's very unlikely that's going to happen, it seems, particularly not only because of that whole relationship and what that might look like and how that might spell disaster for her career, but also the fact that it's a lesbian one, and that added into that we've got other kind of fascinating things coming up around gender. So our main character is also wearing a binder on her chest, and therefore there's this sort of aspect of sort of gender being played with. And actually, in fairness, I'm not sure if we ever really get told the gender of the main character, so I'm making some assumptions here, but there is a sort of a strong amount of queer desire that kind of is happening within this, where there's something forbidden, there's something untouchable, but at the heart of it, the book also seems to sort of veer into potential mystery and potentially these sort of other genres and tropes kind of coming in really interesting ways. So I think a very exciting book, and I'm quite excited to see what comes next from Kay Patrick. I think this book is also quite a tough one to read at times, both in good and bad ways, perhaps, but it's written in this very dreamlike style, which really pulled me in. I think kind of kept me there. That can also mean that, for example, things like speech marks not being denoted can make really understanding what's happening a little bizarre and a little difficult at times. But actually, I feel like that's also the point, that this book is so dreamlike. It's kind of meant to be her sort of veering in and out of thoughts as a main character. So really, really interesting, I think. Next up, I read The House of Doors by Twan, and I adored his last book, The Garden of Evening Mists, which I just think is sublime in so many ways. And so much of the joy of what I really enjoyed about that book comes up here as well. The beauty of the language, the richness of the storytelling, and the book itself is set in largely in sort of colonial Malaysia, or what is now Malaysia, and it concerns at the heart of it a sort of scandal where a white woman, a white British woman, is attacked by a white man, but is, you know, in the meantime, she basically shoots him during this attack. And she is therefore the first sort of white British woman to be tried for murder in Malaysia, or in the kind of colonial place of what is now Malaysia. And the interesting thing that comes from this is then the ways that the dynamics between locals and white British settlers and colonialists plays off against each other. The dynamics in the book previously and up until that point had been very much one of the white British in the area being held in this sort of high regard and being right up there, and particularly, you know, they're the ones with power and money and influence. And so this happening with sort of there being a murder at the heart of it, and this trial, particularly where it looks like the white woman might be hung, it then suddenly creates this really interesting dynamic of, well, you know, how does this also affect the kind of colonial power structures and dynamics where white people in this are trying to hold themselves up as being morally superior, but here's a murder, and you know, it plays off against some really interesting things, whilst also having this real lushness, I think, of talking about landscape and talking about the world around them. And the House of Doors itself is something else that happens in the book that's also, I think, told in this really beautiful, unfurling way. It also features, for example, cameos essentially from real life people, whether they are sort of intended to be really real in this book or not. And actually there's a bit of a nod to it in a sort of jokey way, or not even a jokey way, but a nod to it at the beginning of the book, where an opening sort of epigraph or quote is around how you can't always trust sort of insertions of characters in fiction, because they may appear real, but maybe they're not. And there's something kind of in there as well that I think Twan is really enjoying playing with. Next, I read a book by one of BookTube's very own, Marc Nash, with Death of the Author in Triplicate. And so this I thought was such a clever and brain-melting kind of book, as many of Marc Nash's books are from what I've read so far. And this takes a sort of detective story trope and sort of blows it up a little bit. So we start the book with a character investigating the death of an author, and running around and trying to sort things out and sort of going through this very almost stream of consciousness style thing. A stream of consciousness doesn't really sort of sell it right, but essentially the character walking around having thoughts and acting on every thought. So you know, we get kind of every single insight into their thoughts. So they'll say something, realize it sounds like a song lyric, say the song lyric, and then have a little thought that springs off that. And so we kind of get this really meandering thought pattern. The second part is then the agent and widow of a dead author talking about finishing the manuscript, and, you know, is this going to come from the widow? Is she going to write the final part, or is the agent going to get a ghostwriter to do it? And their whole section is just dialogue of just those two arguing. But they are arguing essentially about what we've just read, because we've just read a book that ends, or part of a book that ends with the letter I sort of scrolled as if someone's just sort of fallen asleep or died on a keyboard. And then the third part of this book sort of references that and is an author tidying up his notes at the end of finishing a manuscript and taking down all these little post-its and kind of everything and sort of saying, oh yeah, I didn't really use that idea, or I did use that idea, but maybe it went differently to how I thought. And in the process talks about like, oh, well, you know, that agent and widow, when they were having a conversation, did I leave that in right? Or I was going to have a third character, the ghostwriter, but then it would have been too difficult. And I've had to have had he said, she said, and everything. And so it's just a book that keeps commenting on what's come before it. It feels like one of those films where you're sort of almost played things in reverse, or where you're shown sort of certain scenes at certain times as sort of self-referential things. So I just thought it was brilliant. I thought it was really clever, really fun, and just one of those books that was, yeah, just I really got massively absorbed into, because I think you are playing the part of a detective, sort of unpicking a puzzle, at the same time whilst reading about detective trying to unpick a puzzle and being kind of commented on yourself as the reader and the writer commenting on themselves. And it just becomes this whole thing, which I thought was really clever and really fun as well. And then here are the two books that I read that are by Irish authors, sort of both Northern and Republic, and that I sort of also just happened to be reading while I was there. So that was quite a nice kind of coincidence, really. The first of which is Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy, which I adored. And I think I'm going to do a separate review on this, just because I think it's such a phenomenal book, especially for such a small amount of pages, really. It's a book ostensibly about motherhood, and particularly our main character, who is just really trying to make it through the day. She is looking after her child, in the face of, you know, a really unequal partnership. You know, her husband is not doing very much, it seems. There's sort of something in there about weaponized incompetence as well, where he seems to sort of say, well, I never do anything because you never let me, because, you know, and that as a result, I'm not good at it. And she says, well, no, like, you're not good at it because you're not trying. And he says, well, you know, how can I ever get good at it? You won't ever let me. And it becomes this sort of circular thing where it never gets resolved. But equally, he never seems to realize a lot of things. You know, the baby will cry and he will look to her to go and pick up the baby. Anyway, this little child is such a fascinating kind of character study, I think, in this book. He's this sort of unreachable figure at times, but also you know, operates in this very like childlike way. You know, he's someone you very much can picture this child. But I think what's especially poignant is this writing has a very dark humor and sort of lyricism to it. And so there are scenes in this book that are utterly crushing, where sort of essentially the mother is really suffering in terms of how she deals with her own thoughts, which are often, you know, very dark, and how she deals with trying to look after her child basically alone. But at the same time, there's this real humor that bursts through it in this very dark way. A line that I love is just, actually, let me quickly find it, is just a really good summary of this, and I sort of posted about this online. But she says, I took you back up. He needs a nappy change. To which your father said nothing. It was the way he said it, though. And I just love that idea of, like, you know, the way he says nothing is loaded and is poignant. And that kind of runs through this whole book. I'm not doing it justice. This book, I think, is phenomenal. It's easily one of my books of the year already, I think. There are some incredibly dark scenes where she is almost murderous in her rage and in her desperation. But there are also these scenes of utter tenderness and joy and this real vulnerability and beauty that courses through it. It's also told in this very yeah, very lyrical, very self-driven kind of style. And that sounds a bit of a weird thing to say, like I'm calling her a Tesla, but you know what I mean? Like there's something propulsive about the way this book drives itself forward. There's a real narrative voice that is so distinct and so special, that I really adore this. I think it's such a great commentary on motherhood and on the difficulties of that, while also just being a really beautiful book to read, in so many ways. And last but not least, I read A Cacophony of Bones by Kerri Dochartaigh. She is someone whose work I've read before. She had a book, Thin Places, come out a couple of years ago, which spoke a lot about spaces between, so things like borders and the spaces there, but also these liminal spaces between moments, between events, between thoughts, between all these other things. And Cacophony of Bones is in some ways a little bit more of a personal memoir, related to sort of some of those things. It kind of often takes the form of a diary of her sort of charting the seasons and charting how nature intersects with various things. So it's sort of a lot around her mental health, nature, things around motherhood, and various other sort of things intersecting. And I think, I mean, it's already beautiful writing anyway, and I think Kerri Dochartaigh has a really gorgeous way of writing that's very dreamlike and very almost spiritual, I think, at times. But I think what's really quite profound here is, you know, the sort of passages where she talks really deeply and really openly about mental health. And she talks about how, you know, there are times when she's really struggling to find any joy, and she's crying almost every day. And nature is not only part of that, motherhood is a part of her, her sort of tiredness, but also her sort of recovery. And there are so many things in this book that I think are just so profound. This way that she writes about being held together by various things in the world. And it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous book. And I think if you get the chance sort of to listen to it as an audiobook, I'd also recommend that, just because I think hearing her read it is just something quite special. Yeah, it's a beautiful book, and I think I'm just really excited to kind of keep reading more of her work in future, because I just think she has this really interesting way of writing about borders and mental health and motherhood and nature and Ireland and so many things kind of in this thing. And they sound disparate at first, but there's a real thread that links them through that I think is really quite clever. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker, talking about the books I read this week. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.